And so when you think of, how that...
And he also continued his passion for education.
Yeah.
My mother placed her entire body over my sisters and me to protect us from gunfire and to make certain that we could not see the terror before us. Thank you. Growing up, my mother made certain she kept our father's essence, his love, values, humanity, and morale very integral in our household. She wanted to make sure that we did not suffer. My mother made certain that her husband remained a part of our household's conversations for as long as I can remember. I knew my father loved me, that he had impeccable integrity and a great sense of humor. I knew that he loved music, poetry, history, and the arts, that he was brilliant, compassionate, loving, and that overall he was led by his service to Allah. In college, I began to learn about the inaccurate portrayals of his character and his life's work. I began to understand that my mother safeguarded the legacy of her husband, not so that he could shine, but so that his legacy and work could be accurately realized for the benefit of future generations. Today, I am here to share with you a bit of what my mother imparted onto me, my father's true story, his impact on America and the world as a whole. My father, Malik Shabazz, popularly known as Malcolm X, came onto the scene of the civil rights movement as a young man, just in his 20s. The climate in America was antithetical to the humanity of African Americans. Jim Crowism and separate but unequal was the law of the land. The rights of African Americans were vanquished under color of law. Individuals and organizations terrorized Black people without fear of repercussion or consequence. America's Black population was essentially without protection and without hope for a just America. In humble submission to God, Malcolm X stood up and stepped forward for all of us. Malcolm jolted the conscience of an America that lacked a moral compass. He quickened our spirits with his urgent demands for equal justice. We came alive with his insistence that America live up to her promise of liberty and justice for all. Malcolm devised a plan of action that would empower all Americans to live up to our greatest potential. In the 12 short years immediately preceding his martyrdom, a young, courageous, and committed Malcolm rose to the defense of African Americans victimized by race discrimination. He challenged notions of supremacy and entitlement. He redefined the American civil rights movement for the first time to include a human rights agenda, and he worked tirelessly to unite the diaspora towards a singular international struggle for freedom and independence. The enormity of his personal sacrifice is not only appreciated by Americans, it is equally appreciated by the global community. The magnitude of his contribution to world history must not be ignored. I think it is fitting that Malcolm X is regarded globally as a brilliant human rights strategist ahead of his time. It is equally fitting that we must catch up. Many of his predictions have come to fruition,
and failure to adopt his strategies has increased the economic, political, and social divides. Malcolm X also retains his place in history as the most celebrated American Muslim responsible for the exponential growth of Islam in the United States. The autobiography of Malcolm X has rightly been hailed as one of the most important nonfiction works of the 20th century, and it remains on the New York Times bestseller list and is required reading in academic institutions throughout the world. A few years ago, I was blessed to read one of my father's diaries. It was a treasure trove of timeless insights and perceptions that revealed the essence of this remarkable young man. He was only in his 20s when the world learned of him, and he was 39 when he was gunned down. And that is a very young man to have made such an enormous impact during the history of our times. In the pages, Malcolm spoke quietly and earnestly during the most critical time of his life. I could experience Malcolm with the cluttering effect of rhetoric and analysis by historians, scholars, or casual observers. He was removed from the discord and pandemonium of systemic racism and its effects, his thoughts, without outside interference, manipulation, or intent to assess the magnitude of this American Muslim icon, Malcolm X. His diary permitted me to travel with him during his Hajj and his subsequent journeys throughout Africa and the Middle East, and to observe his commitment to establishing a blueprint for peace and freedom. Reading the pages, one can better understand that Malcolm battled for all of us until the very end of his life. As I read my father's diary, I could not help but reflect on my own Hajj. When I journeyed to Mecca, I was honored by the sacred invitation to make the religious pilgrimage. I would follow in my father's footsteps to the ancient lands of the Torah, the Bible, and the Quran. My father has always been my greatest source of inspiration. To embark on his journey would prove sacred beyond measure. While in flight, I felt spiritually connected to him. For the first time in my life, I was positioned to personally experience the journey he had detailed in the autobiography of Malcolm X and the chapter on Hajj. With each step along the marbled walkways of Medina, I thought of my father and my mother. I thought of my 5 sisters, Atala, Kabila, Gamila, Lamumba, Malika, and Malak. I thought of my 2 nephews, Malcolm and Malik. And I thought of my niece, Betty Bahia. I prayed that Allah would bless my parents for their tireless sacrifice and service. I sought healing for my family from the devastating loss of our mother. I asked God to grant happiness, safety, and protection to all of us, and that He would assist us to reconstruct a strong, unbreakable unit of which my father would be proud. As I slept beneath indigo skies at the Prophet's Mosque in Medina, I thank God for the exemplary life of my father. As I completed each Hajj ritual, I considered the intensity of his commitment to Allah. My father served God with all of his heart and with every fiber of his being. My father's selfless service began as a minister in a United States organization, the Nation of Islam, America's most prominent African-American Muslim organization. In 1952, at the age of 27, Malcolm became one of the organization's leaders and chief spokesmen. He is credited with increasing 4 temples to 15 temples in 3 years. 2 years later, 50 temples in 22 states, and membership increased from several hundred to hundreds of thousands due to Malcolm's focused leadership and organizational skills. The organization to which Malcolm belonged, income ballooned to tens of millions of dollars annually. Malcolm was also responsible that the organization's principle of self-help, self-determination, and cooperative economics were upheld. Under his leadership, the organization owned bakeries, barbershops, coffee shops, grocery stores, cleaners, a printing plant, retail stores, real estate, 3 apartment buildings in Chicago, a fleet of tractor trailers. Malcolm was working very hard. Farmland in the states of Michigan, Alabama, and Georgia. He was focused and he was committed. The children of the organization attended schools owned and operated by the organization. My father also founded the first newspaper in the basement of our home. It is no wonder that as a result of his determination, dedication, and unparalleled work ethic, that the Nation of Islam owned the largest Black-owned businesses in the United States during the Jim Crow era of race discrimination and legalized subjugation of its own African American citizens. And if Malcolm could do this with all of these challenges up against him, imagine what all of us can do when we come together. My father's humility and loyalty are well documented. Despite recognition for his outstanding accomplishments, Malcolm remained humble, devout in his commitment, and true to his calling. His choice to ultimately take on the name Shabazz was a fitting one. The name Shabazz has a long history in the founding of civilization. The name has various meanings: eagle, falcon, royalty. But one of its most popular meanings is mighty. For some of us, the word mighty evokes ideas of grandeur, dominance, or splendor. But my father was mighty in a different kind of way. Yes, he was strong, but he was also compassionate. Yes, he was vibrant, and some would even say fiery, but he was also sincere. And yes, he was an icon, but he was also a fellow human being. My father was a humanist, a man devoted to the welfare of human beings. He champions human rights for everyone. Over all else, he believed in human beings and that all human beings should be respected as such. His desire was only to serve others and to ensure that the organization's mission would be fulfilled, to genuinely empower his people. I cannot fathom the decision to eject him from the organization or the pain he must have felt as his fellow members sought to betray him. Despite years of faithful service, building the nation from the bottom up, and training his would-be successors, despite the enormous progress of completing every goal, every task, the nation would cast Malcolm from its midst. Being expelled from the community that had been home to Malcolm for so many years was devastating beyond comprehension. To this day, I could not fathom that despite all of his life's work on behalf of millions of others, that he would have been abandoned to feel alone, dejected, and unprotected when he was the most vulnerable. I remain grateful for him, so very proud of his resolve and awe-stricken by the inner strength he was able to summon. He maintained a brave face for the world, provided comfort to his pregnant wife and family, and continued his efforts in the cause of freedom for all. And meanwhile, leaders in the nation and directors within agencies of the United States government signaled to their rank and file that he should be destroyed. Exactly 1 week before his assassination, a firebomb was thrown into the bedroom where his 4 babies slept. As I circled the Kaaba, drank from the Zamzam, and walked between the hills of Safa and Marwa, I felt extremely grateful that my father was blessed with a brief respite from the venomous and vindictive rancor associated with his break from the Nation of Islam and the constant danger created by powerful forces within his government having declared him an enemy of the state. I prayed at the Prophet's mosque, subhanAllah, with gratitude that my father was treated with honor and distinction in the first world land of kings, priests, scholars of historical antiquity. During my Hajj, I was blessed to view the Holy Kingdom through my father's eyes, the eyes of a man who had seen the senseless brutality of racism. In his childhood, he had witnessed his family threatened, harassed, and chased by those who believed the untruths of racist propaganda. As a 5-year-old, he had watched his family home burned to the ground by ruthless members of the Ku Klux Klan, a racist, white supremacist terrorist organization. Young Malcolm and his siblings gathered around their mother when she was told that her husband had been assassinated by local Klansmen. His mother protected them in this moment of profound despair, just as my mother would protect us when my father was brutally gunned down. Young Malcolm witnessed unscrupulous politicians maneuver to steal the family's land and from his widowed mother during the Great Depression. Finally, Malcolm had seen his family crushed by the wicked that placed his mother in a state-run institution which intruded on his childhood and separated him from his siblings. As I climbed Mount Arafat to pray for my parents, I was overwhelmed with gratitude knowing that my father had walked this very land, a Negro embattled since his 20s to gain equal rights for his people, a young man who spent his adult life challenging a government whose systemic racism shackled him within the confines of second-class citizenship. Although his government responded by unleashing all the power of its enforcement agencies and espionage against him, Malcolm remained steadfast and undeterred. He would not quit on us. He persisted in the mission to obtain equality for all. During this God-given respite, for the first time in his life, Malcolm enjoyed the freedoms of first-class citizenship with the dignity and recognition conferred upon him. As I read my father's diary entries, so spontaneously penned during his travel abroad, I envisioned my father, a young man, blossoming in his 30s, selflessly circling the globe after completing his Hajj in search of solutions for this human condition. He is perhaps best remembered for meeting with several African heads of state to internationalize the plight of African Americans, We must not forget, however, that Malcolm was received as a worthy peer by kings, presidents, prime ministers, and potentates alike. Leaders of nations listened to Malcolm's wisdom, his brilliant ideas for ending the atrocities caused by war and unequal distribution of the world's wealth. I will always be grateful that Malcolm carried each of us with him, our plight, our pains, and our concerns, as he occupied the world stage with dignity and grace. Malcolm's command and appreciation for this historic world stage moment was not surprising. For many, he had forever been the powerful and effective born leader. Malcolm was blessed with tremendous intellectual and analytical abilities, and he possessed enormous compassion for others, all of which situated him well for extraordinary leadership. However, most observers do not realize that his innate capacity for leadership had been nurtured before its full fruition by his parents, Earl and Louise Little. My grandparents prepared young Malcolm for this leadership role that he would eventually occupy. Earl and Louise instilled in their son the values of education, accountability, responsibility. As young Garveyites, they were also models of selflessness and sacrifice as they deferred personal freedom for the betterment of society. Malcolm understood that achieving the goal of peace required truth in education and a healthy identity formation. He understood that oppression destroys the psyche and prevents maximum development in both the oppressed and the oppressor. Malcolm understood that misinformation impedes the growth and maximum development of nations, and that race discrimination in particular was preventing America from claiming the greatness that she was destined to achieve. My father purposed to educate all of us about Africa's significant contribution to world history necessary for a healthy identity formation for all of us. Malcolm taught us that people of the diaspora were not simply descendants of slaves. He informed us that our ancestors were architects of ancient civilizations who built pyramids and cities and ships that archaeologists are continuing to uncover even today. Malcolm assessed the transformational power within himself to become an internationally renowned human rights strategist. He remained devoted to the cause of equality and freedom for all. He accepted the mantle of leadership in the human rights struggle because he understood that we are all brothers and sisters under the oneness of God. Malcolm envisioned the world renewed by peace. He denounced war and injustice as indefensible devastations of human and environmental resources. My father worked diligently to expose many of the shortcomings in our human nature, including a planned petition before the United Nations that would call into question the superpowers of the world for denying individual basic human rights, a resolution supported by many of the Muslim countries of the world. His vision for a more egalitarian world rooted in universal human rights resonates to this day. My father remains a source of global inspiration. Even President Barack Obama wrote, as he searched for his own identity, Malcolm's words appealed to him. He said that Malcolm's repeated acts of self-creation spoke to me. The blunt poetry of his words, his unadorned insistence on respect, promised a new and uncompromising order, martial in its discipline, forged through sheer force of will. As I read my father's diary entries, I gained greater understanding of Malcolm, the man. I acquired newfound appreciation for the courage and commitment required to leave the holy land of great martyrs and principled believers. El-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz Malcolm X, the man who would rise to iconic stature, would refuse refuge for himself and his family and choose instead to stand for all of us. He would complete his historic journey and return to the United States, knowing full well that enemies committed to his destruction lie in his wake. The invaluable gift of my father and his life is the wonderful lesson of faith. My father trusted our Lord with his life and with the well-being of his family. He served Allah unconditionally. He remained faithful to the very end. When that fateful day of his martyrdom arrived, we were there with him. My mother, my sisters, and I sat up front, stage right, at the Audubon Ballroom in New York City, which is now called the Malcolm X and Dr. Betty Shabazz Memorial and Education Center. We were present for his address regarding his new federation when the gunshots rang out and he fell forever from our embrace into the arms of his creator. His work and commitment assure me of his eternal peace. He would be proud of all of us who continue to live with his legacy in our hearts and in our minds. He would be proud his words and actions live on through me and through you. And although he would be upset not knowing that we have not yet fully achieved his vision of global human rights, he would be proud to know there are many among us who continue this fight. We must. I thank you for embracing my father as he embraced all of us as human beings in a shared struggle for a better, more just world. His work and commitment assure me of his eternal peace, and inshallah, may we meet him in Firdaus, the highest location in paradise. Thank you very much.